Welcome to Public Health on Call, a podcast from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, where we bring evidence, experience, and perspective to make sense of today's leading health challenges. If you have questions or ideas for us, please send an email to publichealthquestion@jhu.edu. That's publichealthquestion@jhu.edu for future podcast episodes.
It's Lindsay Smith-Rogers. This week, President Trump signed an executive order aimed at reducing prescription drug costs, which, depending on the medication, can cost 10 times as much in the United States than in other countries. Today, Stephanie Desmon talks to Johns Hopkins professor Gerard Anderson about what the proposal entails and whether it has a shot at making a real difference in prices. Let's listen.
Gerard Anderson, thanks so much for joining me.
Well, I'm glad to be here.
So I have you here today because I wanted to discuss a recent executive order from President Trump on lowering prescription drug costs. I know that this is a cause near and dear to your heart and your research. So I'm wondering if you could start by telling us what he has ordered.
So the first thing to recognize is why he has ordered it. And that is that the United States spends 3 to 4 times more to buy a drug than other industrialized countries. We've done some research a couple of years ago where we showed the 3 to 4 times difference. But what we also showed was that there are some drugs where the United States pays literally 100 times more than other industrialized drugs for exactly the same pill. So what he is trying to do is trying to get all countries, or at least the United States, to pay similar rates for very similar products.
Seems like a noble goal.
It is a perfectly wonderful goal. Now the question is, how do you achieve it? So what he is saying is for the next 30 days, he's going to talk, or the people at HHS are going to talk to the drug companies and say, why don't you lower your prices to what other countries pay in the United States? So drop your prices by anywhere from 66% to 75% overnight. We're not going to require you to do this. We're going to very nicely ask you to do this. I cannot imagine any drug company saying, oh, that's a great idea. I'm going to lower my prices, lower my profits dramatically. The other thing that he says that he wants to do is to ask other countries to pay more. Now, this is something that has been around for a long time, and I actually testified in the Senate Finance Committee in the 1990s about this issue. And so it's been around for a long time. And what the pharmaceutical industry wants is for other countries to pay more. Now, other countries go through a very elaborate process to determine how valuable the drug is. How much do other countries pay for the same drug? They have a very elaborate process. The United States has no process. So we're asking countries with an elaborate process to pay more just because we have no process and we pay a lot more than they do. So I think going to France and saying, Emmanuel Macron, please raise your price in France for Zepbound or Ozempic or something like that, just probably is not going to happen or not being well received. Now, it's possible that he'd say, well, then we're going to put a huge tariff on you or something like that. He might be able to threaten something, but at least that's not in the executive order right now. So the two major things he has is voluntarily lower your prices, voluntarily increase your prices in other countries, just don't strike me as having much validity.
Is there any enforcement here, any teeth to this?
So there is a possibility, and there's two that I think of. One is, as part of the Affordable Care Act, we are negotiating drug prices. And we have to set an initial price that we're willing to pay for the drugs. And in the past, we haven't set the price so low that it's at the international price. But what they could do under this executive order is begin the negotiation for the 15 drugs that are going to be done in 2026, 2027 at the international price, and then try to stick to it. So if they try to stick to it, they could get a much lower price. Now, it wouldn't be for all drugs in the United States. It would only apply to the Medicare program. It wouldn't apply to Medicaid. It wouldn't apply to all of us that have commercial insurance. But it would, in fact, lower the price for Medicare recipients for these 15 drugs, assuming that they can get that. I mean, I can't imagine the drug companies be willing to say, I'm going to take a 66% hit, a 75% hit on my price, but if somebody is a great negotiator and can do something, go for it. The other thing that they possibly could do is the Medicaid program. The Medicaid program is not allowed to negotiate prices. It's set up by federal statute that you pay a price and then you get a reduction in that price, a rebate on that price. Now, they could say, instead of getting the rebate, you should pay the international price. And that's a possibility and would make sense, but I don't see that in the executive order. But if I was somebody in HHS, I would take a look at that option and see whether or not you can possibly do it.
So this started under the Biden administration, yes, that these 15 drugs would be lowered through Medicare. So does that change how that negotiation goes, or is it just something we're already working on?
So in the past, we negotiated 10 drugs, or HHS negotiated 10 drugs, and those have already been negotiated, and they will go in effect in 2026. Right before President Trump took office, the Biden administration identified the 15 drugs that the negotiation should start, but the negotiation has just started. And so there'll be another 6 months or so of negotiation. And that's when, if they decide to use international reference prices, they could do that, but that will be a very, very tortuous, very contentious negotiation, because that's rapidly dropping the prices for these 15 drugs. But these 15 drugs represent about 15 to 20% of Medicare spending. So it's not inconsequential.
I have read that the pharmaceutical industry is not pleased by this.
Well, they don't like the idea of reference prices or most favored nation. They don't like that concept. But the way it was laid out in the executive order doesn't bother them very much, because it's voluntary, it's not mandatory. If they decide to make it mandatory, it will take either federal legislation or it will take a regulation that will probably take 2 to 3 years to work through the system. So I don't think they're worried tomorrow or even next year. Now, the whole concept of international reference prices or most favored nations was actually put forward by the Democrats in the House of Representatives. It was called Build Back Better. That was the name of the bill. And that actually passed the House of Representatives when it was controlled by the Democrats, and it got all Democrat votes and 0 Republican votes. So now what President Trump is saying is, Republicans, change your mind. You didn't like it when it was a Democratic initiative, but now that it's my initiative, please vote for it. Essentially use international reference prices. The same Republicans that had all sorts of good talking points on why that was a bad idea would have to turn around and swallow their words and have a totally different perspective on exactly the same issue, which maybe some of them will, but I can't imagine that they will get 200 votes to use international reference pricing. I mean, it's just anathema to most of the Republicans. So I don't see it passing the Congress. And if it's a regulation, it will take a long time, be very controversial, will certainly end up in the courts. And so I just don't see it happening, but I'm not a prognosticator with 100% accuracy, so I don't really know.
So why do we pay so much more in the United States for prescriptions?
Because other countries have very sophisticated systems to determine the value of a drug. Every time you take a drug, it's designed to do a specific thing. The question is, how well does it do it? And how well does it do it compared to other drugs that are on the market? And so you want to pay for a drug that really has an impact. It saves your life. It keeps you from being disabled. It keeps you from whatever it's designed to do. You want the drug to do that. Well, some of these drugs do it very well, and some of them don't do it well at all. And what these other countries do is have a technology assessment activity, which goes through and evaluates the drug as to how well it's doing. And then you get it initially based upon the clinical trial evidence, and then you have real-world evidence. Does it really work in medical practice? So we're able to look at that, and so they might reevaluate the value of the drug. In the United States, we had that in the 1980s and 90s, and we got rid of it. And so we don't have any system where the government, or to a large extent, any public available information says, how good is Zepbound versus Ozempic? And so what we had just this week is a paper that came out in the New England Journal of Medicine funded by a drug company that said our drug works better than their drug. Not surprising that they would try to get that published because it was their drug and they said it was better than the alternative drug. But that's what we're relying on, not somebody without a vested interest in this making the decision. And other countries have that independent government agency making the determination.
Why did we stop regulating the prices?
Well, we stopped initially because Medicare was not involved in it, and the drug companies thought they could do a better job or a more effective job. So it was, to some extent, their political power that got the Congress to say, we will get rid of the Technology Assessment Agency. And we think maybe that it should come back because Medicare is involved and so much money is spent on pharmaceuticals, but that has not happened.
So I guess my last question is, sort of given your expertise and experience in this, why do you think Trump has taken this stance?
It is almost impossible to determine what he is thinking. Now, what we know is that 80 to 90% of the American public is very concerned about drug prices. 40% of people say that they cannot fill a prescription when the doctor orders them. So on the public's agenda, it's a huge issue. And so I think what he's doing is responding to the huge issue. The challenge, of course, is how do you implement that decision? And so he has a bunch of what I will call very vague ideas about how to do it. And maybe the administration will come up with actual ways to implement it. But at least right now, I don't see how they're going to do it.
Gerard Anderson, thanks so much for joining me.
It's always a pleasure.
Public Health on Call is a podcast from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, produced by Joshua Sharfstein, Lindsay Smith-Rogers, Stephanie Desmon, and Grace Fernandez-Cesiri. Audio production by J.B. Arbogast, Michael Bonfils, Spencer Greer, Matthew Martin, and Philip Porter, with support from Chip Hickey. Distribution by Nick Moran. Production coordination by Catherine Ricardo. Social media run by Grace Fernandez-Sassiri. Analytics by Elisa Rosen. If you have questions or ideas for us, please send an email to publichealthquestion@jhu.edu. That's publichealthquestion@jhu.edu for future podcast episodes. Thank you for listening.